Howdy again everyone. Now, while in Japan I got to mess around with the new Sigma 16-300mm f3.5 to 6.7 DC-OS-C lens, and it was a lot of fun. Well, here it is again now in my office for some formal testing. It's Sigma's longest zoom range ever, offering an almost 19 times zoom ratio and starting out at a very wide 16mm. On the aps-c or cropped sensor cameras this thing is designed for, that's the full frame equivalent of 24 to 450mm, which makes this one of the most versatile lenses in the world. Just look at that! Well, you're getting versatility in terms of zoom range, of course. The lens's maximum aperture of f3.5 at the wide end to only 6.7 when zoomed in means that it'll be difficult to use in low light or to get very out of focus backgrounds in your images. It's currently available on L mount, Sony E mount, Fujifilm X mount and Canon RF mount, and its price of $700 or £600 here in the UK is lower than you might expect for a lens with such a huge zoom capability. As I mentioned though, it only offers an aps-c image circle, so if you're shooting on a full frame camera, you will have to revert to its lower resolution crop mode. I'd like to thank Sigma UK for loaning me this lens for testing, but as usual, it's a totally independent review. The lens is long and thin, made of plastic, but it feels solid enough, and at 615 grams or just under 1.5 pounds it does have a little weight to it. It has some weather sealing to it too, including a gasket around the rear mount. It doesn't have many controls on its side, so you have to switch between auto and manual focus in your camera and turn its image stabilization on and off in the menus. Speaking of image stabilization, here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. Considering the very long focal length we're shooting at, the full frame equivalent of 450mm, this is a very steady performance. At the rear we don't get any buttons, just a plastic manual focus ring, which turns nice and smoothly. Some good news is that, whether you're zoomed in or zoomed out, focus breathing is very low on this lens, so you're not being cheated out of any zoom range here, and you won't have problems when shooting video. When it comes to autofocus, the motor works quickly, silently and accurately in single shot autofocus mode. In continuous autofocus mode, the lens focuses lightning fast, so that's pretty impressive too. The lens's zoom ring is large, rubberized and turns very heavily, a bit stiffly. There's no chance of zoom creep with this lens, it stays firmly put into whatever focal length you end up choosing. The lens's front filter size is 67mm and it comes with a plastic hood, which I inexplicably forgot to show in this footage. Overall, the build quality is very good here and its autofocus and image stabilization jump out as being excellent. So let's see about its image quality. These pictures are taken on a 24MP aps-c camera with in-camera corrections turned on. At 16mm and f3.5, image quality is razor sharp in the middle with excellent contrast, and the image corners, sharper than I expected actually. Contrast remains good, but obviously we are seeing quite a bit of purple colour fringing here. f5.6 looks sharper and f8 looks excellent in the corners, but even with those in-camera corrections, the purple fringing is pretty gnarly. Stop down as far as f16, and as usual we see softening from the effects of diffraction. Let's zoom in a bit to 50mm, where the maximum aperture has now darkened to f5.6. Image sharpness is still very good in the middle, but stop down to f8 and it gets a little sharper still. Anyway, back to f5.6 and let's look over into the corners. That's not good, obviously. Stop down to f8 for an improvement though, and at f11, sharpness in the corners is now acceptable. Let's zoom in a bit more to 150mm. At the new maximum aperture of f6.3, picture quality in the middle is surprisingly soft. Yes, that is the sharpest focus I could get the lens into. Stop down to f8 though and sharpness gets okay. Anyway, let's open back up to f6.3 and look over into the corners. Again, they are soft at f6.3, f8 or even f11, so 150mm is a real weak point in this lens. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 300mm. Actually, in the middle, we see a bit more sharpness than at 150mm, but contrast is still on the low side. Stopping down to f8 or f11 doesn't really improve things though. Anyway, back to f6.7 and let's take a look in the corners. again they are rather soft at the maximum aperture at f8 and even at f11. So overall, while the lens is very sharp at its widest angles, arguably the most important area for sharpness, when zoomed in you only really get decent sharpness in the middle and keep away from the 150mm area altogether. The lens can also display some strong colour fringing, so it's only a typically average performance for a super zoom optic really. Let's take a look at distortion and vignetting now. At the wide end we see obvious barrel distortion, although in fairness I was expecting it to be a bit worse than this. Corners are dark at f3.5, getting only a bit brighter at f5.6 or f8. Zoom into 23mm and that flips into pincushion distortion, which gets slightly worse at 35mm. However, as you zoom in further to 120mm or 300mm, the distortion starts straightening out again. Vignetting is heavy at the widest aperture again though, zoomed in. Stop down to f8 or f11 to see those corners brighten up again. So it's the typical super zoom rollercoaster ride for distortion here. Next, close-up image quality, and this lens can focus down to a very impressive 105cm when you're zoomed in, for a maximum magnification of 1:2. Close-up image quality at f6.7 is dreadfully soft though. Unfortunately, at f8 there's a little more contrast. At f11 we see another improvement. It's only at f16 that picture quality looks okay, although obviously diffraction at that dark aperture is robbing us of any serious sharpness. Let's see how well the lens works against bright lights. Here's some good news. The lens seems to be highly resistant to any kind of flaring, whether you're zoomed out or zoomed in. Although, as usual, bright lights directly in the image frame when you're zoomed in will show some glaring. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look for coma and sun stars. The further good news is that we're not really seeing any coma smearing here, even at f3.5. Let's zoom out and look for sun stars then. They begin to emerge at f11. Stop down to f16 or f22 and they get nice and strong. Finally, bokeh. With its dark maximum aperture, this isn't the best lens for getting out of focus backgrounds unless you really zoom into your subject. Its backgrounds always seemed nice and soft in my sample images though. Overall, despite its weaknesses, it's still easy to see the appeal of a lens like this. It's actually a lens that does really well in a lot of areas. Zoom range of course primarily, but it also has a great minimum focus distance, low focus breathing, its build quality is nice, and its autofocus and image stabilization are excellent. Its price is reasonable enough too. The lens's main problem, of course, is its mediocre image sharpness when zoomed in. The image quality there is usable, but far from impressive. So I would say that this could be a good super zoom lens for anyone who primarily wants to shoot at wider angles and to just zoom in occasionally. Thanks for watching everyone, hope you enjoyed the review. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters as well and channel members who help keep these tests trucking on while getting all kinds of exclusive bonus content. Ciao for now.